Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into a world where medical science wasn't quite science. You're not walking into a sterile, fluorescent-lit clinic with piped-in jazz and a clipboard full of insurance forms. No. You're stepping into a cramped apothecary in 17th century London, where shelves sag under the weight of glass jars filled with amber oils, suspicious powders, and something that's definitely moving. The air smells like lavender dust and despair. A cat sleeps in the window, unbothered. There's no hand sanitizer, just a bowl of old lemons. And your physician. He's wearing a wig that might have once belonged to a possum. You sit down carefully on a creaky stool, wondering whether this visit is for your headaches, your melancholy, or your inconvenient habit of being alive in a time before antibiotics. Your doctor squints at you through spectacles the size of teacups, scribbles something on a scroll, and announces the good news. You're not dying. The bad news, he's prescribing leeches. And maybe chocolate. Possibly both. You probably won't survive this, but at least you'll be thoroughly moisturized with goose fat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know what country and time are you listening from right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch the doctor rummage through a wooden box of tools, none of which look remotely reassuring. There's a rusty scalpel, a cloth soaked in something pungent, and a thin stick labeled simply for tongue. He hums while he works, which is deeply unsettling. You try not to make eye contact with the leech jar on the shelf. They already know you're here. He begins your consultation the way all important medical conversations should start, with astrology. Saturn, he says, is in the wrong house. This is bad news for your spleen. Apparently your humors are off, and that's why your back hurts. You nod slowly as if this makes perfect sense. He scribbles a new line. Patient suffers from excess black bile. Prognosis moody. Well, at least he's not wrong. Tell me, he says, leaning forward with great seriousness. Have you recently walked barefoot on damp earth while contemplating betrayal? You think for a moment. Maybe you did take out the compost barefoot last week and mutter about your upstairs neighbor. Aha, he says. Classic imbalance of the melancholic temperament. We'll need to draw some blood. That's how it always starts: a vague symptom, a suspicious theory, and a cure that somehow involves fluids leaving your body. Bloodletting isn't just a treatment, it's a whole vibe. From ancient Greece to colonial America, if you felt faint, weird, or too alive, someone would come along and suggest you'd be better with a few ounces less blood. The idea was to rebalance your humor's blood phlegm yellow bile and black bile, like adjusting the levels on a suspiciously wet sound mixer. You watch as the doctor lights a candle with exaggerated flare. Shadows dance across the shelves. Ah, he mutters, the leeches are still soaking. So instead, he selects a thin, curved blade and begins to discuss the virtues of chocolate. Wait, what did he just say, chocolate? Yes. In one of the more pleasant surprises of historical medicine, chocolate was once prescribed for all manner of ailments. You had a cough, chocolate. Low libido, chocolate. Sad because you live in a time when the average life expectancy is 38 chocolate. The Spanish brought cacao back from the Americas, and within decades, Europe was buzzing with both sugar highs and wildly optimistic health claims. But don't get too excited. This wasn't the silky smooth, hazelnut-stuffed, Instagram-worthy chocolate we know today. This was gritty bitter and often laced with chili herbs or questionable minerals. Think muddy ceremonial potion more than date night dessert. Still, it was better than bleeding into a bowl, so you take the cup he offers. It smells smoky, like wet wood and regrets. You sip. It's awful. But as the warmth spreads through your belly, You can almost forget the man reaching for a linen cloth and muttering something about the proper wrist vein. Across time and place, medicine has often walked a strange tightrope between the sacred and the ridiculous. What seems horrifying now, Leech's bone drills, mercury tonics, was once cutting-edge care. Historians still argue whether some of these methods were more about the performance of healing than actual effectiveness. Was the ritual itself, candles, cloaks complex, Latin incantations half the medicine? You start to think yes, because right now, even though you've done nothing but drink something nasty and listen to this man talk about bile, you do sort of feel calmer. He pats your arm and says, "Your bloodletting can wait. The moon's not right yet." You try to nod sagely, like someone who deeply respects the moon's influence on their internal fluids. He gives you a ginger biscuit and a piece of charcoal to chew for your teeth. You feel oddly pampered. Then he takes out a large book labeled General Remedies and Superstitions and begins reading aloud. His voice is calm, almost melodic, and the words blur together in a dreamy mix of medieval recipes and outdated optimism. Somewhere between ointment of toad marrow and gruel for memory loss, your eyes begin to close. The next morning, or what might be the next moment, you find yourself back on that stool as the doctor examines your wrist with the intensity of someone deciding where to plant a very small, very aggressive garden. He mutters something about good tension in your veins, which would be flattering if you weren't fairly certain he was about to stab you with a 400-year-old piece of metal. You try to look brave, which mostly means you sit very still and blink very slowly. The room feels even dimmer now. The candle wax has puddled like lazy snowdrifts across the table. Outside, a donkey brays. Inside, a leech wiggles in its jar, probably humming the medieval equivalent of "I'm coming out." You briefly wonder if anyone in history ever looked at a leech and thought, yes, this is clearly a medical professional. The doctor takes a silk ribbon and ties it around your arm. Not too tight, just enough to make your veins politely rise like guests summoned for a toast. The blood must be free, he says, as if that explains anything. He dips a cloth in warm water, dabs your wrist, and positions a shallow brass bowl beneath your hand. "Now breathe in," he says, "and think of geese." Oddly specific, but okay. This is where it begins, the ancient ritual of bloodletting beloved by the Greeks, the Romans, and pretty much every medieval barber surgeon who couldn't find his scissors. The logic, as flawed as it was elegant, held that most illnesses stemmed from an imbalance of bodily humors. And what better way to balance them than to let some of them out? Hippocrates, that bearded father of medicine, was a big fan. Galen, who came later and had a flair for drama, basically built his whole medical empire around draining people with alarming confidence. By the time you reach the 1600s, bloodletting isn't just common, it's expected. If you go to the doctor and don't leave lighter by a pint, were you even sick? The doctor lifts the blade, pauses for theatrical effect, then gently touches it to your skin. It's a surprisingly quick prick, less like a slice and more like being kissed by an angry paperclip. Blood wells up dark and thick and begins to flow into the bowl. You feel a little dizzy, though it's unclear whether it's the blood loss, the cocoa from earlier, or just the general vibe of medical theater happening around you. "You're doing splendidly," the doctor murmurs, which is a lie, but appreciated. He tilts the bowl, examining your blood like a sommelier, checking for legs on a vintage Merlot. "Sanguine," he says, nodding wisely. "The color of robust excess." You want to ask what that means, but decide to focus on not fainting. Historically, bloodletting was used for nearly everything: fevers, headaches, hysteria, heartbreak, gout, indigestion, and the occasional case of just not feeling quite right. And if your ailment didn't improve after the first round, No problem, they'd just do it again. And again. And again until your symptoms cleared up or you, cleared out. Historians still argue whether bloodletting ever actually worked or if it was a placebo wrapped in tradition and mild anemia. Some say it reduced high blood pressure in a crude and exhausting way. Others suggest it helped certain inflammatory conditions, though, at what cost? There are accounts of patients being bled until they fainted only to be revived and bled again. Somewhere Galen is clapping. As your own bowl fills, the doctor reaches for a second. Just a little more, he hums like a vampire, in business casual. You've lost enough blood to donate to a very confused time traveler. But you're still here, still awake. And weirdly kind of sleepy. The act of sitting still being fussed over and watching your body trickle out into a bowl is more hypnotic than you expected. The room spins softly. The flickering candle makes shadows dance like old ghosts practicing Tai Chi. The doctor dabs your wrist with a sprig of something that smells like mint and regret. You're wrapped in a blanket now. Someone, possibly the cat, pats your foot in approval. And then, with no ceremony at all, the bleeding stops. The doctor presses a scrap of clean linen to your wrist and ties it off with a bow. There now, he says, you're much less excessive. He writes something down, probably cured by partial exsanguination, patient somewhat smug. Then he offers you a warm mug of, yes, more chocolate. Because clearly what your body needs after blood loss is caffeine and a mood-altering alkaloid. You sip it slowly, letting the bitterness settle behind your teeth. This batch tastes different, earthier, with hints of cinnamon and questionable logic. This is Aztec style, he says proudly. Very fortifying. May cause visions. That last part is said a little too casually. You sink back into the chair as the cocoa sloshes softly in your cup. The room feels far away now. The doctor's voice has become a low hum, like bees in a library. Your fingers tingle slightly, and you wonder whether it's from the blood loss or the cinnamon. Maybe both. The doctor pulls a small mirror from a drawer and holds it up. You look pale, regal even. Very fashionable, he assures you. All the noble patients are doing the anemic glow this season. You giggle quietly, dreamily, and the cat purrs in agreement. For a moment you believe this man might actually know what he's doing. Then he knocks over the leech jar, screams, and dives under the table. The leeches inch toward you with leisurely menace. You sip your cocoa and watch them approach, too tired to panic. Maybe they know something you don't. The leeches move with a kind of dignified determination, like old ladies at a fabric sale. You, on the other hand, are glued to your chair, both literally thanks to a mild chocolate spill and metaphorically due to the precise mixture of exhaustion, anemia, and vague curiosity. The doctor is still under the table whispering something to the cat that sounds like a negotiation. You blink slowly as a leech edges up your shoe. It pauses. You swear it winks. This apparently is your introduction to leech therapy. Technically, it's called hirudotherapy, but no one in this room is fancy enough to use that word. What you're about to experience is a practice with roots older than most civilizations and slimier than most vegetables. Leeches, you learn, have been medicine's go-to wet spaghetti noodle of healing since at least 1500 BCE. The ancient Egyptians used them. The Greeks adored them. The Romans couldn't stop talking about them. There are temple murals, papyrus scrolls, and suspiciously poetic odes to their efficacy. Somewhere out there, a very old tomb probably contains the world's first leech retirement plan. The doctor finally emerges, brushing dust off his coat and pretending none of that happened. Well then, he says, adjusting his wig with shaky dignity. Shall we proceed with the alternative treatment? He opens a much smaller jar, this one with just 3 leeches floating like bored astronauts, and lifts one out with wooden tongs. It dangles briefly, then curls, then stretches toward your arm with the enthusiasm of a toddler discovering a pudding cup. You try not to flinch. You try even harder not to scream. The leech is placed gently onto your skin, and then the real magic begins. At first, it doesn't seem interested. It wriggles a little, pokes around, perhaps considering the real estate. Then, without warning, it latches on. There's a sensation that can only be described as a wet paperclip mixed with a surprise static shock. You inhale sharply. The doctor claps. Excellent. That means it's working. Working at what, you wonder? Leeches don't just suck blood. They inject a complex cocktail of enzymes that thin your blood, prevent clotting, numb the area, and mildly confuse your immune system. It's basically nature's version of a deluxe IV drip, but without the dignity or the Wi-Fi. In fact, one of the enzymes, hirutin, is still used today in certain blood-thinning medications. So yes, weirdly, they do have medical value. Just not for everything. But that wasn't always the opinion. For centuries, leeches were seen as a kind of universal panacea. Got a fever, leech. Aching joints, leech. Mysterious swelling, several leeches. Grief over a lost love, leeches. And probably some wine. During the 18th and 19th centuries, France alone imported millions of leeches annually, so many that rural populations of the creatures were nearly wiped out. That's right. We bled them out by accident while trying to bleed ourselves. Historians still argue whether the obsession with leeches was driven by real results, a lack of alternatives, or simply because they were a portable, reusable, and satisfyingly dramatic cure. The leech gave doctors something to do, a tangible, wiggly way to show effort. And patients watching their blood disappear into a tiny worm with ambition felt reassured that something was happening. You glance down. Your leech has swelled. It's doubled in size and looks deeply content, like it just finished a 3-course meal and now wants to talk politics. The doctor removes it carefully and drops it into a jar marked used. A chill goes up your spine. He places another on your shoulder. This one takes its time exploring like a hiker, admiring the terrain. The cat watches with interest, occasionally pawing the air like it wants a turn. You don't move. You don't blink. You exist now only as a buffet. The doctor hums a tune from what might be the Renaissance, or might be something he made up on the spot. You wonder if there's a patron saint of bloodletting, or if they all politely declined the title. Probably for the best. No one wants their miracles tracked by the pint. As the second leech fills, you start to drift. Your thoughts slow. The warm cocoa, the bloodletting, the soft candlelight, it's all folding into itself like a memory being gently archived. You think about how odd it is that such a disgusting creature could hold such reverence in medical history. You think about how it's still used today in rare reconstructive surgeries, helping with venous congestion. You think vaguely about how your elbow itches and whether that's a bad sign. Then the doctor removes the leech, dabs the wound, and places a bandage over your skin shaped like a tiny star. For morale, he says. You manage a sleepy smile. He asks if you'd like a third. You politely decline by tipping sideways onto the examination couch. He nods in understanding and begins tidying up. The leech jar is sealed. The cocoa is reheated. A lull settles over the room, thick as honey and just as sweet. As you fade deeper into that syrupy half-consciousness, one thought drifts lazily through your mind. Somewhere out there, someone once paid money for this. And somehow, it worked. You wake up, or rather you resurface on a cushioned bench beside the window. The light outside has shifted gold now and soft, as if the world knows better than to disturb you with anything resembling urgency. Your wrist is bandaged, your shoulder has dried leech spit on it, and your cup of chocolate is somehow still warm, which is either comforting or unsettling, depending on how closely you examine the laws of thermodynamics. The doctor is in the corner, rearranging a shelf labeled Theoretical Remedies, which appears to include dried toad's powdered pearl and something politely labeled miscellaneous powder. You sit up slowly, wondering not for the first time how you ended up trusting your wellness to a man who uses astrology and amphibians in equal measure. "Ah, you're awake," he says, as if you've returned from a long and noble voyage. "Would you care for a bit of historical context?" You nod, not because you feel particularly curious, but because your limbs haven't fully remembered how to disagree. He sits beside you, opening a book bound in soft leather and the unmistakable scent of mushrooms. "Let me take you back further," he says, "to where all this madness began. Long before chocolate was stirred, and long before leeches were nicknamed physicians' apprentices, there were temples, and in those temples, healing didn't require degrees. It required rituals. And just like that, you're transported, carried by voice, by velvet memory, and perhaps a tiny bit by whatever was in that Aztec-style cocoa. You stand now figuratively in the cool stone corridor of an ancient Egyptian temple. Incense curls like ghostly script along the walls. A priest in linen robes hums as he prepares the instruments of healing sacred oils, amulets, and yes, leeches. Leeches in ancient Egypt weren't just practical, they were spiritual. They were often invoked in healing incantations and placed delicately upon the ill, not unlike how we today slap on a Band-Aid and pretend it's a personality. Some scrolls even suggest leeches were associated with Heka, the god of medicine and magic. You imagine one particularly glamorous leech wearing eyeliner and holding a tiny staff. Meanwhile, across the ocean and forward a few centuries, India's Ayurvedic texts were also praising the humble leech. Known as Jalauka Vacharana, the practice was detailed in Sushruta Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit surgical text that casually includes instructions for removing tumors and apparently managing blood disorders with the gentle application of clingy worms. You're a little impressed. Historians still argue, the doctor says, thumbing through the book, whether leeches were actually effective back then, or if their use persisted because of religious awe, social ritual, or just sheer momentum. You nod slowly, the kind of nod reserved for moments when you're not entirely sure if the conversation is scholarly or deeply irreparably strange. He continues. In these ancient cultures, the body wasn't just biology. It was cosmic. If you were sick, you were out of alignment, not just internally, but with the stars, the seasons, even your ancestors. You briefly picture a family reunion ruined by someone's spleen imbalance. By the time ancient Rome arrives on the scene, togas, sandals, and the occasional stab wound medicine has taken a more catalogued, slightly smug turn. Pliny the Elder, that walking Wikipedia of the ancient world, mentions leeches as part of his natural history, alongside snake fat, onion paste, and whatever else was within arm's reach when someone sneezed. Roman physicians prized order. They had charts, rules, and firm beliefs in the balance of the four humors. And while they still bled their patients with knives, they began favoring leeches for delicate work. The eyelids, the gums, the very tips of fingers. You shiver slightly, unsure whether you're horrified or just cold. There's even some evidence that leeches were carried in special silver tins. Leecheries, if you will, like pocket protectors for the health-conscious senator. A nobleman might arrive at a feast with olive oil in one hand and a bloodsucker in the other. Charming. Your doctor chuckles at the thought, adjusting his spectacles. Of course, he says, not everyone used leeches responsibly. Some folk used them recreationally. Others believed leeches could extract bad thoughts from the temples. There are records of poets, philosophers, and kings willingly allowing their foreheads to be nibbled by parasites in hopes of relieving melancholy. You raise an eyebrow. To be fair, he adds, it was a different time. No one had cable. Outside, the sky begins to deepen. The golden light fades to bronze. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings 8 times, or perhaps that's just your heartbeat, echoing through the bloodletted silence. The doctor stands, stretching like a man who's spent too long comparing ancient medicine to slightly damp spaghetti. What do you think, he asks, almost shyly. Not so silly, is it? The idea that leeches were healers long before we gave them Latin names and clinical permission. You take a deep breath. Your limbs feel floaty, your mind fogged but full of curious clarity. Maybe it's the storytelling. Maybe it's the cocoa. Or maybe you've discovered that the strangest part of medicine isn't the tools. It's that people always believed in them even when they were very clearly worms with ambition. You rest your head gently against the worn velvet of the apothecary couch, and the doctor, still buzzing with the triumph of historical storytelling, glides across the room to a locked cabinet. You hear the jangle of keys, the creak of hinges, and then the unmistakable clink of glass on glass. He turns to you with an expression that can only be described as gleefully conspiratorial. I think he says it's time to meet the professors. You blink. He opens a box labeled in crisp, handwritten ink, educated leeches, trained in Galenic philosophy. Inside, floating like tiny coiled scrolls of intent, are the stars of medieval medicine. These aren't just any leeches, these are trained leeches. You don't ask how they were trained. You suspect it involved Gregorian chants, and maybe a very tiny diploma. Now, he continues, we're entering the age of rational bleeding. He says this with the same tone someone might use for modern dentistry or satellite weather forecasting, which is impressive considering the next item he holds up is a medieval woodcut of a man being bled from the soles of his feet while holding a chicken. You close your eyes and smile. Of course. Welcome to Europe in the Middle Ages, where medicine was more or less a patchwork of half-remembered Roman texts, divine guesswork, and monks who had read just enough to be dangerous. But even so, things were becoming structured, organized. There were rules now, schedules, flowcharts of bodily fluids. If the earlier centuries were all jazz and incense, this was classical music with a side of organized hemorrhaging. Doctors of the 12th and 13th centuries believed deeply in specificity. Not just any vein would do. They'd consult intricate diagrams called phlebotomy charts, maps of the human body color-coded by organ temperament lunar phase, and what you had for breakfast. Need to fix your liver. There's a vein for that. Headache. We'll tap the foot. Heart trouble. Maybe the thigh. Are you by any chance feeling overly cheerful for the season? Let's drain that right out of you. You imagine the medieval physician as a kind of Renaissance barista, one who specializes in steaming cups of your own bodily fluids. And like any good artisan, he's proud of his tools. The doctor now places one of the leeches on your ankle. This one seems more sophisticated than the last, quieter, more deliberate. You suspect it's read Chaucer. It nestles in with a determined sigh, like it's been waiting centuries for a good pair of socks to cling to. As it feeds, you hear the doctor explain that during the Middle Ages, leeches weren't just used for disease, they were part of preventive maintenance. Noble families scheduled regular bloodletting sessions the way we now book dental cleanings or oil changes. Feeling fine. Well, let's make sure you stay that way with a quick drain and a biscuit. Monasteries became the keepers of both health and leech lore. Monks meticulously bred and farmed leeches in clay pots and small ponds, a quiet act of devotion that somehow involved more slime than scripture. These leecheries were a vital part of the medieval medical economy, and a particularly serene monk could spend hours whispering to his aquatic co-workers. Historians still argue whether the monks believed the leeches truly healed, or if the act of applying them simply reinforced a broader system of moral and cosmic order. In a time where sin and sickness often blurred to bleed, was to be made clean inside and out. Your leech finishes plumping like a tiny wineskin and drops off with a lazy splat into the waiting brass bowl. The doctor nods solemnly and flicks holy water over it. "They've earned their rest," he whispers. You briefly wonder if he's going to build a tiny leech monastery. As he prepares another leech, this one designated for your left elbow, you find yourself marveling at the medieval commitment to systematizing the absurd. They truly tried to make science out of squirming worms and moon charts. They held university debates about how many leeches could be used before enlightenment occurred. There were leech quotas per season. Someone somewhere had to audit that. Your mind wanders as the next leech sets to work. The room is dim, now illuminated by only a single candle and the faint glow of legacy. You begin to notice how quiet the world has become. Outside, the wind sighs softly through cobblestone alleys. Inside, the cat needs a pillow with clinical detachment. And you're left with the very real understanding that for hundreds of years, this exact scene was someone's best shot at survival. They walked into rooms like this, sat where you sit, and entrusted their bodies to men who believed that inside every sickness was too much of something, and that the only way out was through a small, determined bite. The doctor tucks the spent leech into its velvet-lined case, murmuring something that might be Latin or just deeply sleep-deprived English. He pats your arm gently. "You're coming along nicely," he says. You smile, unsure whether to be reassured or mildly alarmed. Either way, it's working. You feel lighter, floatier, like your blood is a few pints closer to harmony. And to be fair, that's exactly the point. You rest now in that mellow space where time doesn't matter, and questions seem unnecessary. The candle beside you flickers with a lazy rhythm, like it's nodding off, too. Your arm, freshly bandaged, tingles faintly from the leech's goodbye kiss, and the doctor, cheerfully oblivious to modern hygiene standards, is stirring something thick and fragrant over a tiny iron stove. Cocoa again. Of course. He waves a spoon thoughtfully in your direction. You know, he says, at some point they decided bloodletting wasn't quite enough. Enter chocolate. He pauses, waiting for dramatic effect, or perhaps the sugar to dissolve. And not just any chocolate, medicinal chocolate. You arch an eyebrow, or at least you try. You're too relaxed for facial expressions. The doctor ladles the chocolate into a ceramic mug shaped like an owl and presses it into your hands. It's heavier than you expect. The steam rising from the cup smells like cinnamon wood smoke and vague delusion. You sip. It tastes better this time, less bitter, more like the dessert your medieval ancestors wished they had invented on purpose. Before it was comfort food, he explains, chocolate was medicine, a sacred thing, a bitter elixir of strength, stamina, and occasional hallucination. He chuckles. Also, gas. But that was more of a side effect. Your cocoa-coated lips curl slightly in amusement. He paces the room like a man delivering a lecture to invisible students. It begins, of course, with the Olmecs, possibly the first people to domesticate the cacao plant. But it was the Maya and Aztecs who elevated it, turning chocolate into a divine substance. They drank it bitter, foamy, and cold, often seasoned with chili annatto or cornmeal. Not a marshmallow in sight. You picture a Mayan priest sipping his spicy brew while watching a solar eclipse and judging your modern diet. To them, chocolate was life, the doctor says. It was nourishment sacrament, and a cure-all. From snakebite to sadness, from childbirth to battlefield fatigue, it was believed chocolate could strengthen the body and calm the soul. You glance at your mug. It seems up to the task. When Spanish conquistadors returned from the New World in the 1500s, they brought cacao with them, not always willingly, and certainly not politely. But once it reached Europe, something curious happened. It became fashionable. And then, medicinal. Doctors, priests, and philosophers alike sang the praises of the new drink. Chocolate was said to improve digestion, ease liver pain, reduce coughs, banish female troubles, and even lift the melancholy that plagued artists, poets, and people who lived through English winters. That last group, you suspect, needed something stronger than cocoa, but it was a start. One physician in the 17th century wrote a pamphlet titled "Chocolate, a Physician's Delight," in which he claimed that a daily dose could restore vigor and prolong life. He also recommended avoiding cheese, which makes you question his judgment entirely. Historians still argue whether the so-called medical benefits of chocolate were legitimate, or simply an excuse for aristocrats to drink melted joy by the gallon. Some claim it improved circulation or lowered inflammation. Others believe it just gave people something warm to cling to in an age when bathtubs were a privilege and toothpaste was made of crushed bones. Back in the apothecary, the doctor is now preparing an absurdly elaborate cocoa prescription. He tosses in a pinch of ground cloves, a splash of almond milk, and something from a jar labeled "Optional Courage." You don't ask. There were bitter debates, he says, sprinkling nutmeg like a man conducting a ritual. Some physicians swore chocolate was too stimulating, that it overexcited the blood and made people frisky. Others said it soothed the heart and opened the mind. There were even bishops who tried to ban it for being sinfully delicious. You chuckle into your cup, nearly snorting cocoa. You can practically see a row of powdered wigs frowning at their breakfast. In France, the doctor continues, chocolate became a matter of national pride. Court physicians prescribed it to Queen Anne of Austria to treat her low spirits, and to Louis XIV to, well, stay lively. He believed it gave him a royal constitution, which I think is code for not needing naps. You imagine Versailles, glittering chandeliers, elaborate wigs, a powdered prince sipping cocoa with a leech hidden in his boot. A strange, intoxicating world where medicine tasted sweet and doctors wore perfume. The doctor now passes you a small plate of cocoa-dusted almonds. You take one with slow fingers, half dreaming of Aztec temples and French palaces. The almond crunches delicately, grounding you in the here and now. He leans in, voice dropping to a whisper. You see, chocolate was never just food. It was ceremony, a medicinal mystery, a luxury that pretended to be a cure. He taps his temple. Even when it didn't work, it felt like it did. And that, my friend, is half the battle. You nod slowly, lulled by the warmth in your belly and the soft hush of history rolling over you like velvet. Would you like a little more? He asks. You extend your mug. Of course you would. The second mug of chocolate is even thicker than the first, more like a melted dessert than a drink. You cradle it with both hands, like a small animal, aware that you're essentially holding history in liquid form. The doctor watches you approvingly, the way a barista admires someone finally understanding the depth of single-origin espresso. Now he says, pulling a stool up beside you, let's talk about what kind of medicine chocolate really was. He says this with the flair of someone revealing that your cough syrup was once moonshine. Was it food? Was it drug? Was it aphrodisiac? You nearly choke, Not from scandal, but from a clump of unmelted spice hiding in your sip. The doctor pretends not to notice. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe was a mess of confused morality and aggressive hot beverages. Coffee, tea, and chocolate were all arriving on the scene at roughly the same time, and society didn't quite know what to do with any of them. Coffee made you too alert. Tea was too foreign. And chocolate was suspiciously pleasurable. Church officials fretted, physicians bickered, royal advisors panicked over whether the queen was enjoying her medicine too much. As with so many things in human history, the line between health tonic and sinful indulgence was razor thin and frequently ignored. You sip again, and the warmth spreads like a slow blush down your chest. It's hard to believe that this moment, this simple luxury, was once outlawed in certain monasteries because it supposedly inflamed passions. You picture a row of monks' robes in disarray having an existential crisis over a mug of cocoa. Reasonable. Some doctors warned that chocolate might overheat the blood and create wild imaginings. Others swore it was calming, clarifying, even pious if consumed on holy days. It depended entirely on who you asked and what mood they were in. In Italy, chocolate was considered a gentle medicine for the elderly. In England, it was treated with suspicion until it became fashionable among writers and poets. And in Spain, where the drink had arrived earlier via conquest, it was already entrenched in the daily rhythm of court life. There it was served in delicate cups, often spiked with orange blossom water, anise, or even pepper. One Spanish noblewoman had hers stirred with a gold spoon by a designated cocoa servant, because of course she did. Historians still argue the doctor says swirling his own mug with theatrical intent, whether chocolate's reputation as an aphrodisiac came from genuine chemical effects or simply from how scandalously good it made people feel. You glance down at your cup. It is undeniably a mood. The doctor shifts topics with the grace of a tour guide turning a corner. Of course, he says there were more medical uses. He opens a drawer, retrieves a battered book with gilded edges and thumbs to a page with a hand-drawn diagram of a stomach wearing a monocle. Digestive health, he announces. Chocolate was once prescribed for constipation, for acid reflux, for indigestion, and for something charmingly labeled a sluggish temperament of the bowels. You take another sip, partially out of curiosity, partially as preventative maintenance. In Germany, apothecaries sold chocolate tinctures that claimed to cure melancholy, improve sleep, and restore the sparkle to dull eyes. You try not to roll yours. In France, women were encouraged to drink chocolate to maintain their complexions. One beauty manual claimed it would soften the disposition and render the skin pleasingly fragrant. You wonder if this explains why people fainted so much. Back then, they were simply overwhelmed by chocolate-scented elegance. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few grumpy scholars labeled it an agent of sloth, and one famously dour physician insisted it led to premature contemplation of one's own mortality, which sounds a lot like reading philosophy after a breakup. The doctor grins as he reads this aloud. I suppose they just needed to take it with a pinch of optimism, and perhaps sugar. You finish your mug. It leaves a shadow of warmth in your chest, like a cat curling up beneath your ribs. Outside, the sky has deepened to indigo. Inside, the doctor begins lighting small lanterns around the room, their soft golden glow illuminating dusty tomes and dusty corners in equal measure. And just as your eyes begin to droop again, he adds, You know chocolate was once recommended instead of leeches. You sit up slightly. This is new. Yes, he says. Gesturing to a pamphlet pinned behind glass, there was a brief, glorious window where some progressive physicians suggested that if the body needed balancing, perhaps sweetness could restore it better than bleeding. A revolution by dessert. You respect it. He continues. Of course it didn't last. The old ways clung tightly, but still imagine the hope of it that healing could come from warmth, comfort, and a little indulgence instead of sharp teeth and linen bandages. You imagine it, you live it. Right now in this strange room full of leech jars and antique cocoa, you're suspended between two worlds, one brutal one, oddly tender, and both somehow believed in their cures. The doctor pulls a blanket over your shoulders. You've had enough therapy for one evening, he says. You nod. Chocolate agrees. You're not quite sure when it happened, but you're now reclining on what might be a fainting couch, or possibly just a very well-upholstered plank, wrapped in a soft woolen blanket, with something that smells faintly of cloves and mothballs. The cocoa in your belly is humming gently like a lullaby composed by someone with a mild addiction to cardamom. The doctor is bustling in the corner, humming a tune you don't recognize, but immediately trust. Before we drift too far into chocolate dreams, he says there's a chapter of medical history that demands just a little more of your blood. You sigh gently. Of course there is. He beckons you with a finger, and you follow him somewhat floaty now into the next room. It's larger, warmer, filled with golden light from glass lanterns, and a long velvet chaise, where 3 decorative pillows seem to whisper, recline dramatically. On the wall, delicate sketches of fashionable women, each being bled politely. Some from the arm, some from the ankle. One appears to be offering her earlobe with suspicious calm. Welcome, he says, sweeping his arm theatrically to the spa where bloodletting became fashion. You blink, not in confusion but in awe. Yes, this was a real thing. By the time the 18th century rolled around, medicine had developed a flair for drama. Gone were the grubby back rooms and leech-soaked sacks of the Middle Ages, well, mostly. In their place rose elegant clinics in Paris, Vienna, and London, where high society could go to be gently drained while sipping mint water and gossiping about horse breeding or the weather in Florence. This was therapeutic bleeding as social ritual. It was no longer something grim you endured in desperation. It was something you scheduled like a manicure or a scandalous rendezvous. Doctors now called physicians if they wore the right wig catered to the upper class, with delicate silver lancets, velvet cushions, and soothing conversation. In fashionable circles, it became almost suspicious not to be bled once or twice a season. Historians still argue, the doctor says, handing you a plate of sugared almonds, as if to soften the next sentence, whether these sessions offered any true medical benefit, or if they simply gave the anxious aristocracy a sense of control in a deeply chaotic world. You chew slowly, nodding. Nothing screams, "I'm in charge of my life," like voluntarily letting someone poke a hole in your ankle. In France, these bleeding salons reached truly luxurious heights. Some even had separate lounges for recovery, where fainting was considered elegant and pallor was praised. You could go in for a headache and emerge with a paleness so refined birds might land on your windowsill just to hear your woes. It was a fashion statement. Pale meant delicate, fragile, enlightened. Never mind that you were also slightly dizzy and prone to fainting spells. That was simply part of the aesthetic. In England, the practice took on a more somber tone, less salon, more club. Think smoky rooms with leather chairs, brandy decanters, and a man named Harold bleeding quietly behind a screen while someone read aloud from Gulliver's Travels. Some patients, the doctor adds, became true connoisseurs of bleeding. He gestures to a glass cabinet filled with elegant tools, some silver, some ivory-handled, all terrifying. They had favorite veins, preferred instruments. They compared physicians the way you might compare tailors or opera singers. You raise your eyebrows, gently. Everything feels slow now, as though the very air has been exsanguinated. And then he shows you something truly remarkable. A small velvet-bound book labeled Madame de Lépin's Bleeding Journal. Inside are pages of elegant cursive listing her preferred bleeding dates, favorite physician's notes like Tuesday drained 6 ounces from left elbow. Felt remarkably light afterward. And occasionally, a star doodle. For flair. You can't help but smile. There's something deeply human in it, all this desire to catalog the experience, to find meaning and method in the messiness of health. Of course, not all bleeding salons were glamorous. In rural towns and cities, far from the powdered elegance of Versailles, people still lined up outside apothecaries, hoping for a miracle, or at least some sweet relief from whatever ailed them. Some believed the bleeding released not just illness, but bad energy, evil spirits, grief. A universal unburdening dripped slowly into a bowl. There are records of husbands and wives scheduling joint bleeding appointments like couples massages, but much wetter. Even children weren't spared, especially if they appeared too spirited or had freckles in unfortunate locations. The doctor raises a single eyebrow as he recounts one case in Italy where a family reportedly requested bloodletting because their son had become too joyful. You consider this for a moment, you're not sure what's more disturbing, the request or the fact that the doctor agreed. And then there's the matter of the treatment schedule. Some people kept meticulous calendars color-coded by organ: Monday's liver, Wednesday's lungs, Saturday's general malaise. One noblewoman reportedly refused to attend a royal ball because her spleen had just been vented and she needed rest. You chuckle softly. It's all so absurd, and yet not that different from today. We've swapped leeches for lifestyle apps. Calendars now track hydration steps and meditation minutes. But the goal is still the same. Feel better. Feel lighter. Feel seen. The doctor hands you a cup of cool rose water. To restore your humor, he says, clearly proud of the pun. You sip it. It tastes like a perfume factory fell into a stream, but you appreciate the gesture. And as you lie back on the velvet chaise, surrounded by the ghosts of patients, past some noble, some neurotic, all slightly paler than they began, you begin to understand something unexpected. Medicine has always been part science and part performance. And tonight you've had front-row seats. You're still reclined, drifting somewhere between curiosity and full-on nap mode, when the doctor claps his hands softly, like a man calling the attention of a particularly sleepy flock of ducks. Now that you've seen the elegant side of things, he says, pulling back a curtain to reveal a slightly dustier bookshelf, let's visit the chaos. The era of shouting snake oil and suspiciously enthusiastic chocolate salesmen. He picks up a pamphlet with frayed edges titled, The Modern Use of Cacao in All Afflictions, including melancholy female vapors and overdrafts. On the cover is a drawing of a man in a large hat selling chocolate out of a wooden cart, labeled Dr. Tremble's Restorative Tonic. His mustache is alarming. Welcome, the doctor says, to the great turf war between doctors, quacks, and cocoa peddlers. You blink at him. He nods solemnly. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine was booming. And by booming, we mean that literally anyone with a jar of something and a loud enough voice could call themselves a healer. Licensed physicians, self-taught apothecaries, traveling remedy men, and the occasional con artist all jostled for influence in town squares, parlor rooms, and early printed newspapers. And chocolate. Oh, chocolate was their favorite pawn. One week, it was the answer to depression. The next, it was being blamed for everything from indigestion to hysteria to spontaneous fainting near romantic poetry. The doctor now flips through pages of old medical advertisements. You peer over his shoulder and find gems like cocoa's gentle influence for the liver, the nerves and marital enthusiasm. Dr. Bixby's brain, balsam now with 20% more chocolate and 100% less snake venom, guaranteed to relax the bowels and the soul. Some claims were laughable, others were accidentally effective. The line between quack and genius was blurry at best, especially when the medicine tasted like dessert and came in decorative tins. You imagine a dusty frontier town where one man's leeches compete with another man's hot chocolate. One promises purification by parasite, the other inner peace through cocoa dust and bold fonts. Both wear top hats. One might have a chicken. Historians still argue the doctor murmurs whether the era of chocolate as cure was more exploitative than helpful, or if in their own strange way these remedies filled a gap mainstream medicine ignored. Because, let's be honest, proper medicine was often cold, painful, and deeply unaffordable. Cocoa vendors with their colorful wagons and charming jingles offered not just physical relief, but hope, warmth, and occasionally free samples, which honestly puts them several steps ahead of your current insurance provider. And then there were the doctors, the trained ones. They weren't amused. Medical journals began publishing scathing critiques of cacao quackery, warning readers that chocolate was not a cure for everything, especially moral lassitude. One surgeon declared that the public had become cocoa intoxicated, which you imagine is just a fancier way of saying blissfully overcaffeinated and unwilling to return to vinegar tonics. Some physicians fought back with science chart studies and the occasional passive-aggressive letter to the editor. Others decided if you can't beat them, join them. And so the age of chocolate pharmacies was born. Apothecaries began stocking premium blends of cocoa with added medicinal herbs. There were nervine chocolates for anxiety, digestive chocolates for stomach complaints, and even tonic chocolates for general constitution enhancement. These were often sold with respectable-sounding labels like fortifying cacao compound or liquid chocolate tincture for the modern gentleman. You look down at your hands half expecting one to be holding a 19th-century chocolate lozenge wrapped in tinfoil and Victorian optimism. The doctor walks you over to a cabinet filled with old tins. He picks one up. This one, he says, tapping the label, claimed to cure jealousy. Just jealousy. He opens the tin. It's empty of course proof, he says, that someone somewhere was very emotionally unbalanced. He returns to his chair this time with a small porcelain cup filled with aromatic cocoa bitters. You sip. It tastes like betrayal and cinnamon. The best part. Some of these chocolate remedies actually did something. Cocoa contains theobromine, a mild stimulant, and phenylethylamine, which, while unlikely to cure heartbreak, does give the brain a little sparkle. So when people said they felt better after a dose of medicinal chocolate, they weren't entirely imagining it. Their hearts beat a little faster. Their mood lifted. And if the placebo effect kicked in, even better. By now you're curled up like a cat beneath the blanket. The story is swirling through your brain like cream in hot cocoa, blending history and absurdity into one strangely soothing concoction. You picture a woman in a corset standing in a crowded square, listening to a man with an outrageously feathered hat shouting about his cacao tonic for feminine resilience. She buys a bottle. It tastes like burnt molasses and faint rebellion. She takes it home, drinks it in one go, and maybe feels strong enough to walk out on that dreadful fiancé who smells like horseradish. You smile into the pillow. Stranger things have happened. The doctor lifts your empty cup, replaces it with a warm compress for your forehead, and dims the lantern. You've survived leeches, he whispers, and now the chocolate charlatans. You nod. Barely. Your eyes are already halfway closed. It's been a long day of bleeding and sweet talk. The room smells faintly of beeswax, old books, and cocoa, an aromatic trio that suggests something between a monastery and a very sleepy cafe. You lie still wrapped in a warm blanket, and wrapped more abstractly in disbelief that people once paid to be bled on purpose, and then rewarded themselves with a mug of chocolate flavored with anise and mild delusion. The doctor tiptoes back into view, now wearing a pair of spectacles so round they resemble teacup saucers. He carries a clipboard. He looks like he's about to deliver either your diagnosis or a monologue about your aura. "You've come far," he says, checking an imaginary box. But you should know it didn't last. Eventually, people began to suspect that perhaps, just perhaps, parasites and powdered beans weren't a cure for literally everything. You gasp in mock surprise, the kind that requires no effort, because you're already halfway to unconsciousness. He leans on a cane that wasn't there before and says, "Let me tell you about the decline." The slow, reluctant, occasionally chocolate-covered realization that we may have been doing medicine a little bit wrong. In the mid-19th century, medical science began to change, rapidly. This was the age of germ theory, microscopes, anesthesia, and hand-washing, not necessarily in that order. A young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that women who gave birth in hospitals tended to die more often than those who delivered at home. His solution: wash your hands. Radical. But as cleanliness and data crept in, leeches started to lose their shine. They had once been symbols of learned care, tiny, squishy miracle workers. Now they were becoming awkward, old-fashioned, more associated with superstition than science. And chocolate. Well, it too began to undergo a transformation. Once a bitter, sacred drink, then a doctor-prescribed tonic, it was now entering its next phase, comfort food. Thanks to innovations in processing like the conching technique developed by Rodolphe Lindt in 1879, chocolate became smoother, sweeter, and suddenly dangerously delicious. You imagine a physician in 1880 frowning at a patient's test results while his assistant unwraps a chocolate bar behind him. The doctor sighs. Give him quinine, and save the cocoa for dessert. Historians still argue whether society was better off when people believed chocolate could treat heartbreak and headaches, or whether the shift toward science stripped medicine of its poetry. But one thing is certain: the transition wasn't instant. There was a long, awkward overlap where people still scheduled bloodletting just in case, while also hearing whispers about microbes and sanitation and invisible things that weren't demons, but kind of acted like them. The world of medicine had one foot in the future and one leech still firmly attached to the past. In America, President George Washington was famously bled 4 times in one day in a frantic attempt to save his life during his final illness. Spoiler, it didn't work. Many now believe the treatments hastened his death. Even so, bloodletting remained popular in the U.S. well into the 1800s. It was part of the standard medical toolkit, alongside purgatives, mustard plasters, and stern looks. Meanwhile, cocoa was busy infiltrating the marketplace in a new form: confections. Sweet shops popped up across Europe and America. Chocolate shifted from apothecary to candy counter. It no longer wore the disguise of medicine. It didn't have to. People wanted it anyway. But even as the science advanced, and the leeches were quietly retired to ornamental ponds and awkward metaphors, there were those who clung to the old ways. Small-town doctors who swore by seasonal bleeding. Grandmothers who gave cocoa for colds and heartbreak alike. Traveling salesmen who still hawked cacao bitters with a knowing wink and a slightly too smooth accent. You picture one now, a man in a velvet waistcoat standing on a crate in a town square, selling chocolate syrup laced with herbs and hope. A child buys a bottle for her grandmother. A widow buys one for herself. And somewhere deep in their very human hearts they believe it'll help. Because sometimes belief itself is medicine. The doctor sits beside you again. He's unrolling a parchment with 2 columns, leech-based treatments on the left, chocolate-based treatments on the right. Under leeches, you read ear infections, gout, swollen eyelids, night terrors, inability to properly wear a powdered wig. Under chocolate, you find weak digestion, mood imbalance, creative blockage, excessive sighing, romantic disappointment, chronic. It's hard to say which list is more absurd. Or more familiar, you whisper. Did any of it really work? He shrugs. Some did, some didn't. But for a long time, people felt cared for. And that, my dear patient, is harder to measure than blood volume or caffeine content. You look down at your hands, still slightly cocoa-stained, and feel something settle in your chest, not just warmth, but understanding. It's not about the tools, it's about the ritual, the soft lighting, the attentive doctor, the warmth of the drink, the attention to your pulse, the gentle voice telling you you'll feel better soon. Even if all that came from a leech and a cup of bitter sludge, even if some of it didn't work, even if some of it never really did. You close your eyes. The doctor gently tucks the list back into the drawer and whispers, "Rest. You've survived the age of excess. The cocoa will carry you from here." You wake to the gentle sound of a page turning, the kind of soft, velvety rustle that only comes from books older than your great-grandparents. The doctor sits nearby, cross-legged on a low stool, flipping through what appears to be an oversized medical journal bound in cracked leather and bravado. The cover reads, "Respected Treatments and Wild Guesses, 1798 edition." You stretch just enough to feel your joints remember they're part of history now. The air smells of dried lavender and, is that nutmeg? Your nose twitches like a well-read rabbit. I thought, the doctor says, without looking up, you might enjoy some stories of famous patients. The great and questionable minds who once trusted their lives to chocolate or leeches. You nod sleepily. This is a good genre. Let's begin close to home, he says, flipping to a marked page. George Washington, beloved general and reluctant president. You know what killed him, right? You blink. He doesn't wait. His doctors. They bled him, repeatedly gave him blistering agents, applied poultices to his neck, and offered emetics all within 24 hours. Rough estimates say he lost over 40% of his blood in one day. You wince. Historians still argue whether he would have died anyway from the throat infection, but most agree the enthusiastic treatments didn't help. Let's just say the leeches got their fill that night. The doctor turns the page. Now, over in England, we have Lord Byron, poet of brooding and boats. He once claimed that chocolate heightens the powers of thought, which may explain some of his more dramatic verses. He also lived on vinegar and biscuits, so his opinions should be taken with a mug of cocoa and a skeptical brow. You smile. You imagine Byron pale and tragic scribbling poetry in a lakeside villa fueled by bitterness and a very thick Aztec blend. Then we have Voltaire, he continues, French philosopher, witty, sarcastic, probably insufferable at dinner parties. He reportedly drank over 50 cups of chocolate a day. You choke. The doctor nods. 50. Some said it fueled his intellect. Others suspected it gave him terrifying heartburn. Either way, he lived to 83, which was basically immortal for his time. He flips again, revealing a sketch of a very wiggy man with wide eyes. And here we have Benjamin Franklin. He was a known enthusiast of both cocoa and leeches. He promoted smallpox inoculation, designed bifocals, and wrote extensively about gout, which he may or may not have tried to treat with dark chocolate mixed with rum. Honestly, we've all been there. You sip the new mug the doctor hands you. It's cooler now, less spicy, more honeyed, like it's preparing you for a nap rather than a duel. And don't forget Catherine de Medici. He adds who brought chocolate to France in the 16th century, reportedly calling it a potion of harmony. She gave it to her ladies-in-waiting to ease menstrual cramps and melancholy. You nod solemnly. This is the most reasonable medical advice you've heard all night. And finally, he says, lowering his voice for drama, we arrive at Napoleon Bonaparte, who carried chocolate lozenges into battle. Not for pleasure, but for stamina. They were his pre-battle snack. You can almost picture him charging across Europe with a handful of cocoa nuggets tucked in his boot. You whisper, that's absurd. He grins. That's history. You lie back, letting the parade of powdered wigs and cocoa-fueled egos wash over you. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that even presidents, emperors, and romantic disasters once sat in rooms like this, trusting in strange elixirs and slimy remedies, hoping for rest relief, or perhaps just a moment of peace. Because no matter their status, everyone had one thing in common, a body that hurt a spirit, that tired, and a desire to feel better by any means necessary. Sometimes that meant bleeding a little. Sometimes it meant chocolate. Sometimes it meant both. And in between the absurdity and the alarming recipes, there's something deeply human in those choices. The doctor closes the journal with a soft thump, sending a puff of dust into the air. You sniff. Who else drank chocolate while bleeding? He chuckles. Well, Beethoven reportedly took hot chocolate before composing. He also believed cold baths improved his hearing, so grain of salt there. Mozart favored cocoa before performances. And Jane Austen's brother ran a chocolate shop, where she often sipped while writing letters and novels, though it's unclear if she ever tried the leech cleanse. You both nod. That would have been quite the chapter. The candle burns lower now. The room seems quieter. The book returns to its shelf. And as the doctor draws a curtain across the window, blocking out the now moonlit street, you feel a deep, silly sense of connection. To presidents and poets, queens and quacks, to a world where sometimes the cure for your affliction was just a little cup of something warm. The doctor moves quietly, now footsteps muffled by thick rugs and centuries of fading tradition. He lights a smaller lamp, this one tinted amber, and the room shifts with it, warmer, more honey-colored, like the world is exhaling. He returns with a goblet, not a mug this time, but a curved glass etched with curling vines and the occasional cherub. Tonight's dose, he announces, is of a more royal variety. You accept it without question. After Leeches, you've stopped questioning most things. It's a blend from a very particular case, he says, settling into his favorite armchair, the one with mysterious scratches on one leg. A true royal prescription. Equal parts drama, pseudoscience, and cocoa. You sniff the drink. It smells like melted velvet and overconfidence. Let me take you, he says to the court of King George III. You may know him as the monarch who lost America. But what's often forgotten is that he also lost from time to time his mind. The diagnosis is still debated, possibly porphyria, possibly bipolar disorder, possibly just the accumulated weight of powdered wigs and poor dietary fiber. But whatever the cause, the treatments were reliably absurd. During one particular episode, the doctor explains his royal physicians decided to cut back on bleeding and focus more on gentler remedies. One of which was yes, chocolate wine. You blink. Yes, he repeats, clearly thrilled. Red wine infused with chocolate honey and a touch of cinnamon. It was meant to calm the nerves, settle the bowels, and restore mental equilibrium. Which sounds impressive until you realize it was mostly just dessert with medical aspirations. You sip. It's delicious. You suddenly feel deeply royal. But George wasn't alone. Across Europe, members of court were being prescribed chocolate by doctors who genuinely believed it could realign the soul. In Vienna, one empress drank it before prayer. In Portugal, a queen took it after confession to lift the gloom. And in Spain, courtiers had it stirred with silver spoons at dawn to ward off nightmares. Of course, the dosage varied. Some patients were told to take it daily, others only when visions returned. A few were advised to mix it with opium, a decision that history has retroactively labeled bold but questionable. Historians still argue the doctor adds adjusting his collar, whether these chocolate prescriptions had any consistent effect, or if they were simply royal indulgence rebranded as health care. He flips through a velvet folder filled with yellowing parchment. Ah, here it is. Prince Theobald of Saxony, afflicted with melancholy, and an unfortunate fondness for heavy lace. His doctor wrote, and I quote, "Prescribed warm cocoa at sunset to temper inner storms and chill the choleric bile." You nod solemnly. That sounds legitimate. Another case, Lady Estelle de Beaumont, who suffered from hysteria, which at the time meant anything from insomnia to speaking her mind too often. She was advised to drink chocolate 3 times a day, perform daily embroidery, and avoid loud noises, especially from goats. You sip again? No goats here. You're doing fine. And then there's Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, who refused to bleed, refused to fast, and insisted his ailments could be solved by what he called the cocoa cure. He traveled with his own chocolate cook. And while his military campaigns were disastrous, he was reportedly very cheerful in defeat. The doctor closes the folder, clearly delighted. You see, he says, chocolate became a kind of catch-all cure for the genteel classes. It promised to calm, to nourish, to comfort. And unlike so many other treatments, it didn't taste like chalk or beetle powder. It was the rare remedy that people wanted to take. And unlike leeches, it didn't crawl off mid-session. But it wasn't always frivolous. There were cases especially among the exhausted and the over-medicated where chocolate seemed to offer genuine relief. An early account from Naples, for instance, describes an aging duchess recovering from a months-long illness with nothing but rest-warm blankets and a twice-daily mug of dark, blessed cocoa. You wonder briefly if the cocoa cured her, or if the act of sitting still breathing deeply and being cared for was the true remedy. The doctor pours you the last of the chocolate wine and offers a toast to foolish cures and sacred sweetness. May we never fully outgrow either. You clink glasses. The candlelight flickers lower now. The journal closes with a sleepy thud. And in this strange velvet-lined world of powdered princes, moody poets, and ambitious physicians, you find yourself completely unshakably calm. Because in the end, whether it was a leech or a goblet of chocolate, the true cure may have always been this: someone staying up with you when you couldn't sleep. The candle now burns low, a little nub of light nestled in a puddle of golden wax. Shadows pool in the corners of the room, not ominous, but cozy, like the edges of a dream waiting patiently for you to slip in. You lie back deeper into the cushion cup, resting on your chest, the aftertaste of royal cocoa lingering on your tongue, like a secret you weren't supposed to know. The doctor returns this time, carrying what appears to be a scholar's satchel stuffed with scrolls, bound pamphlets, and what you swear is a dried leech tied with a red ribbon. He sets it all down and announces, "Now for the academics." You blink. There were academic leech debates. "Oh, my dear listener," he says, cracking his knuckles with academic glee. You have no idea. He pulls out a stack of documents labeled with titles like "On the Resilience of the European Medicinal Leech" and "Cocoa," a bitter account of its medicinal efficacy and moral ramifications. You groan softly into your blanket. Yes, he continues, ignoring your very audible sigh, for every poet waxing lyrical about chocolate's healing warmth. There was a gentleman in wire-rimmed spectacles shouting in Latin about enzyme responses and gut phlegm. Let's start with leeches. He lifts a parchment and reads in his best pompous tone. The efficacy of hirudo medicinalis in balancing humors remains observable, though unreliable in patients with naturally optimistic dispositions. You stifle a laugh. Naturally optimistic dispositions were clearly a threat to 19th century medicine. Historians still argue, he says, pulling out another about the anatomy of leeches themselves. How many stomachs do they have? One long one. Several chambers, can they digest magic? He raises a brow. That last one is from an anonymous 1723 tract titled The Esoteric Leech, which I should mention was banned in Vienna. You murmur, understandably. But then the real debate begins. The doctor spreads out 2 columns of texts on one side, learned physicians praising the precision of bloodletting, and on the other equally educated voices calling it a macabre theater of fluids and superstition. Some papers include clinical drawings of leech placement patterns with helpful labels like for spleen agitation and for wayward thoughts. Others flatly accuse leech users of prolonging illness by removing all the patient's energy along with their dignity. One doctor wrote in 1831 that leech therapy had become as fashionable as powdered wigs and just as hollow, while another claimed that the leech was divinely engineered for the sacred extraction of imbalance. You imagine a university debate spiraling into chaos as one professor slams a jar of leeches on the table and declares, "These are my credentials." The cocoa in your system warms in appreciation. Then the doctor switches sides to chocolate. He reads, "It is not merely a drink, but a movement of the spirit. In the right hands, chocolate can pacify storms of melancholy, correct digestive stagnation, and if properly frothed, soften the soul. You picture a philosopher in a ruffled shirt holding a steaming mug and staring out a rainy window feeling very emotionally corrected." But just as with leeches, the chocolate debates weren't all cinnamon and good feelings. Many academics were suspicious of its popularity. Some said it overstimulated the heart. Others said it coated the stomach in a way that confused the bowels. One alarming entry suggests it may lead to excessive imagination, which sounds like a compliment, honestly. You snort quietly. Even the Jesuits got involved. One Jesuit scholar in 1685 wrote a 40-page sermon arguing that while chocolate was acceptable on fasting days, only if it was unflavored and consumed with regret. You imagine a monk sipping bitter cocoa and muttering, "I deserve this." But for every critic there was a passionate defender. A physician in Prague claimed chocolate cured his own depression and allowed him to write 5 treatises in 1 month. Another in Florence swore it cured his wife's migraines and kept his children from lying. Bold claims, but the chocolate industry was grateful. The doctor gently spreads out the final piece of parchment, its edges scalloped, like it was once chewed by a librarian mouse. This, he says reverently, is my favorite. An anonymous essay published without attribution in 1822, titled In Defense of Gentle Remedies. He reads, "Let them bleed and blister if they wish. I would rather be warmed than wounded. I have no proof that cocoa fixes the soul, but I have noticed the soul rarely objects. I shall keep sipping until better evidence arrives." You let that sink in. That's the thing about medicine, isn't it? Sometimes it's not about molecules or mechanisms, it's about how something makes you feel, whether that's a kiss from a determined leech or a sip of something warm on a cold morning. And as the doctor begins rolling up his scrolls, he glances at you with a wink. "You don't have to choose," he says. "Science is lovely, but so is comfort. And sometimes the two overlap in a steaming mug or a very, very well-trained worm. You chuckle softly, or maybe that's just your soul exhaling. The candle is now barely a flicker, a golden dot holding the night at bay. You can't remember the last time you felt this slow, this gently marinated in trivia and cocoa. The doctor moves about the room like a ghost in a dressing gown, now humming something you think might be a lullaby, or possibly the theme from an 18th century leech farm advertisement. You're not sure. You've stopped verifying reality. Before we finish, he says, lighting a fresh beeswax taper, you ought to know how the leeches, well, left us. You blink. He means historically, not personally, though a glance at the sealed jar on the shelf reminds you that anything's possible. As medical science advanced, antiseptics microscopes, thermometers that didn't involve mercury and faith, the leech began to look outdated. He picks up a small jar labeled Retired Professionals. Inside, preserved in something gently bubbling, are 3 bloated, content-looking leeches floating like little organic punctuation marks. They didn't disappear overnight, he adds. Old habits cling. But gradually people began to prefer pills to piercings. Hospitals stopped keeping leech basins. Medical schools replaced bloodletting charts with anatomy lectures that didn't involve lunar calendars. By the early 20th century, leeches were no longer trendy. They were punchlines. Even chocolate, once the toast of every apothecary, had moved on. It was no longer medicine. It was snack. It was indulgence. It was the thing people sneaked into theaters and broke diets for, not the thing you took because your spleen was misbehaving. Historians still argue the doctor muses whether this was progress or simply preference, whether we really grew wiser or just developed better packaging. He gestures to a corner of the room where a forgotten display sits a Victorian chocolate pill case, sold briefly to help ease nerves and disappointment. Inside each small square was a dose of bittersweet medicine, and probably a tiny lie. The leeches, meanwhile, found refuge in obscure surgical wards. Plastic surgeons still used them quietly when trying to reattach fingers or ears or flaps of skin that stubbornly refused to rejoin the circulatory party. In these cases, the leeches served one final miracle, draining excess blood-clearing clots, keeping new tissue alive. You picture a medical intern somewhere in Cleveland opening a drawer and finding a leech kit, blinking twice and saying, "You want me to what?" But it worked. And it still works. Even in the world of sterile gloves and high-definition imaging, sometimes the solution is a little worm with ambition. Chocolate, too, has its hold. Yes, it was stripped of its titles no longer. Physician, no longer elixir, but it never lost its power. Instead of being a cure, it became a comfort, a ritual, a reward, a friend. And isn't that what medicine was always meant to be? The doctor now opens a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside are tokens, bits of the past he's clearly been collecting. A tiny silver bleeding bowl. A ceramic chocolate cup with a worn handle. A miniature chart of the humors drawn in beautiful script and complete confusion. This, he says, is the heart of it. We think of medicine as something cold, clinical, sharp. But for centuries it was deeply personal. People brewed, blended, prayed, hoped, bled, sipped. They tried. He sits beside you now. The room is quieter than ever. The kind of quiet that feels padded and safe. There was a time, he says softly, when a doctor's job wasn't just to treat, but to attend, to sit, to stay up with the sick and keep watch while the body made its slow repairs. Sometimes all they had was leeches and cocoa, but they gave them with care. You feel something settle behind your eyes, not tears, but their gentler cousin, the feeling of being seen. The doctor lifts a final parchment blank, except for one sentence written in the center. The most powerful cure is presence. He tucks it back into his journal, smiles, and rises to dim the final lamp. You lie still, cocooned in warmth, your body humming with every strange, silly, beautiful fact you've absorbed. Presidents and poets, monks and monarchs, salesmen and surgeons all clinging to tiny miracles and mugs of meaning. And you here now, part of that lineage, not seeking a cure, perhaps, just a little peace, which in the end might be the same thing. The doctor moves more slowly now. The urgency has faded. He's not lecturing anymore, just tidying, humming, folding cloths, and placing old scrolls back in their slots like bedtime toys. Even the cat has gone quiet, curled into a crescent of contentment beneath the stove tail, twitching once every few minutes, perhaps dreaming of leeches wearing tiny bonnets. You meanwhile are more horizontal than vertical, your limbs fully surrendered to gravity and the last hints of cocoa. The room is warm, almost womb-like, padded with time and stories. Everything feels both impossibly old and somehow just beginning. The doctor reappears with a final offering, a steaming ceramic pot, nestled in a knit sleeve with a label written in ink that curls like ivy. It reads, "Final brew, for gentle rest and very slight philosophizing." He pours the liquid into a small cup and hands it to you with a wink. The scent is familiar now, chocolate, but with hints of lavender and a whisper of orange. It tastes like dusk, like the moment before a door closes, like something warm saying you're safe now. He sits beside you one last time, not as a doctor but as a storyteller, finishing a tale that was never really about the plot. "You've heard so much tonight," he says softly. "About the absurd and the sacred, the sweet and the squirming, the long journey we made from draining the body to comforting the soul." He gestures vaguely toward the jars, the books, the long faded illustrations of veins and temperaments and misunderstood organs. All that he murmurs was us trying to understand the mystery of being human. And maybe he adds with a smile, we still are. Outside, the wind shifts, a tree rustles. The world beyond the apothecary carries on satellites, beam traffic lights, change. Someone checks their phone for the 5th time this hour. But in here, it's still, and slow, and soft. The doctor looks at you one last time. "Sleep isn't just rest," he says. "It's the oldest medicine we have. It's the moment when the body says, 'Let me try again tomorrow.' And sometimes all we need is someone to sit beside us while we wait for that moment to arrive." You don't respond. You're already halfway there. He rises, gently extinguishes the final candle, and whispers, "I'll be here, just in case you need one more story." Then he leaves you to the quiet. The light has gone now. What remains is the velvet dark, the kind that wraps around your shoulders and doesn't ask any questions. Your body is still the tension long forgotten, your breath shallow and soft. There's no need to remember everything you've heard tonight. The strange remedies, the powdered wigs, the jars of optimism and ancient guesswork. They were simply doorways, little stepping stones into sleep. And now you've arrived at the edge of it. You feel the weight of the blanket, the warmth in your core, the gentle hum of a world that just for this moment expects nothing of you. Not a single thought needs to be held. You can let them drift one by one like petals on slow water. Let the names blur. Let the centuries soften. Let the chocolate and candlelight and leech whispers fade into the gentle background of a dream not yet formed. Your body is doing what it knows best, letting go. No performance, no fixing, no remembering, just you, breathing, floating, sleeping, and somewhere not far but not quite close, a candle flickers again, a story opens, and the night stretches out its arms like an old friend saying, "I've got you. Sleep well now. Tomorrow can wait."